You're about to see a shocking new documentary. It's about UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, an agency that gets, an organization that gets $1 billion a year from foreign governments, mainly United States, Canada, and the European Union. UNRWA runs the schools in the Palestinian refugee camps. The curriculum is an incitement to murder Israelis, to murder Jews. It's a jihadist curriculum, and the staff, the teachers, are mostly people that have known links with terrorist organizations. Let's go now to the producer of the documentary, journalist David Bedein in Israel. Hi, David. Thank you for joining us.
From Jerusalem.
David, you've done a stunning new documentary that brings to light things that people never really knew, never really dreamed of. Can you tell us about it?
What we have here is a curriculum which is training Arab children for war against Israel. It's not a curriculum supported by Saudi Arabia or by Iran or by Martians. It's supported by 38 democracies in what's called the Refugee Working Group. That's the coordinating body that helps Palestinian refugees, Arab refugees, and the chairman of that body is Canada. Now, most people assume that a refugee camp is designed simply to feed people and have people just make ends meet until they get settled. But this camp, this system, which has been going on for 63 years since the birth of the State of Israel and the creation of UNRWA, is designed to perpetuate itself and to forever keep the Arabs in refugee camps ad infinitum. Now, this is despite the fact that the rest of where the Arabs live in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, there's a flourishing economy. In the city of Gaza, in the city of Hebron, in the city of Bethlehem, in the city of Shechem, in the city of Jenin, you have Ramallah, a flourishing Arab economy. However, next to these cities, you have refugee camps run by the United Nations under the premise and promise that they're supposed to go back to where they came from in 1948, even though those villages do not exist.
In their textbooks, there is no mention of Israel. There's no mention of Tel Aviv. There's no mention of Eilat.
There's two very small mentions of Israel from the time of the Oslo Accords, and that's it. There's 38 maps, new maps produced by the Palestinian Authority, which UNRWA shares with all of its 500,000 children, and those maps completely eliminate Israel. Every Israeli city becomes a Palestinian city. It's extremely important. This you'll see on the program itself. Now, there are those who say that these, just because it's in the curriculum, it's not being taught. What we show in the film, not only is it being taught, but the entire atmosphere in the UNRWA camps is an atmosphere of war preparation, and preparing the children in the next generation to make war to liberate all of Palestine.
You were actually in the camps filming this?
Well, yours truly was contiguous to the camps while the crew was inside the camps, and my director was in there. I have been in all these UNRWA camps at some point or another over the past 40 years. Currently, when I produce these films, I have the crew inside the camps, including an American and an Israeli correspondent who work for me in the camps together with an Arab crew.
What exactly, Canada has an official position with UNRWA. What exactly is Canada's position?
Canada has been reevaluating its position with UNRWA ever since our agency produced the evidence for the Canadian government and also for the European Parliament that Hamas, the Hamas terrorist organization, took over the UNRWA union. That's number one. So that basically the education system, and also not only the education system, but the whole administration is being run by Arab terror groups. So Canada has been reevaluating. Canada is providing, of the $1.2 billion, Canada provides a small amount, $15 million, mostly for food supplemental programs.
Which comes out of our taxpayers' pockets.
Forgive me for disrupting. I emphasize again, Canada is the chairman of the Committee of Nations that supports UNRWA. That's what's important and if Canada were to call a conference of all 38 nations that supply all of the money to UNRWA and ask questions and start conditioning the aid to UNRWA, that UNRWA would adopt principles to resettle, rehabilitate the descendants of Arab refugees instead of keeping them in their squalor.
Okay, let's see the film, and we'll talk about it after.
The film you are about to see is narrated by a Palestinian journalist. It shows how UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, is financing school curriculums that glorify terror and suicide bombing. Children are being inoculated with the belief that any and all means possible, including violence, must be used to reclaim Palestine, which for them means all of Israel. The United States is one of the major sources of funding for this work, and therefore, indirectly, is helping to produce a generation of children for whom the armed struggle to liberate Palestine is central to their lives. For 60 years, UNRWA has operated the camps, and even now wants to continue the status quo. For the Palestinians, what does that mean? Another 60 years of a hopeless existence in camps with no solution in sight? But that's not the end of the story. This film will take you to Chile. There, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which handles refugees from all over the world, has launched a pilot project to resettle thousands of Palestinian refugees. Once stuck in Iraq, many are now in Chile, where a life of hope is being held out for a new generation of Palestinians. Wars in the Middle East may not have easy solutions. Still, the message of this film is that there is a humanitarian solution to the continuing scar of Palestinian refugee camp existence.
Hello, my name is Sarah Masad, and I want to tell you about life as a Palestinian with UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. UNRWA was founded as a temporary organization 60 years ago after the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. UNRWA was established to help refugees deal with their temporary plight in the wake of that war. It was never intended to become a permanent refugee agency. 60 years ago, UNRWA fed anywhere from 450,000 to 750,000 refugees from the 1948 war. That was an important act of kindness. But instead of working to resettle Palestinians, it has become a permanent agency, always encouraging Palestinians to return to their villages, even though they no longer exist. This policy has turned into a fantasy and has served as a collective punishment to good, hardworking people like myself. We want the opportunity that others in a democracy might have to find meaningful work, provide a good education to our children, and instill proper ideals and family values. Instead, we have become locked in a battle between the Palestinian nationalism and UNRWA's inability to effect real change in its camps.
The number of Palestinian refugees keeps growing as UNRWA continues to grow. UNRWA recognizes not only the original Arabs who claim to have been displaced, but their descendants as well. Now, the number of people on the UNRWA rolls has grown to more than 4 million. They live in and near 59 UNRWA camps in the West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. With 38 democracies across the globe contributing, UNRWA has an annual budget of more than $1 billion. In recent years, its budget has ballooned, with the US and EU each contributing more than $260 million a year. Other major donors include Canada, Japan, Norway, and Australia. But since 1950, the U.S. has been the largest single donor, contributing approximately $4 billion to UNRWA. UNRWA is responsible for the camp's education, health, relief, and social service programs, It leaves the day-to-day operations to local Palestinians known as popular committees, who operate inside the UNRWA facilities. Meanwhile, UNRWA spends about half of its budget each year, more than $500 million, on schools. It has a massive payroll, employing more than 22,000 educators. UNRWA does not produce its own textbooks. Its policy is to adopt the texts and curriculum of the host entity. In the West Bank and Gaza, it uses new textbooks and course guidelines produced and utilized by the Palestinian Authority.
Over the years, life here has changed, and much of it has to do with strict adherence to Islamic law. As you can see, I'm wearing a hijab, or a head covering, which is now the custom of Palestinian Muslim women.
Violence in UNRWA camps can often be traced to Islamic militancy, with groups like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade openly calling for young children to sacrifice themselves as Islamic martyrs. Thousands of members of these radical Islamic groups are now employed by UNRWA. Even the teachers' union in Gaza, almost 10,000 educators, is openly affiliated with Hamas, and some have called for the children to become suicide bombers. Still, even now, UNRWA denies that Hamas workers are on its payroll.
It's another false allegation without any evidence to substantiate it. It's part of the destructive rhetoric of this conflict, which does no justice to anybody who has any interest in trying to promote a peaceful resolution to this conflict. We at UNRWA are transparent and accountable.
Hamas as a political organization does not mean that every member is a militant. And we do not do political vetting and exclude people from one persuasion as against another.
Hamas Education Minister Mohammed Askul confirmed that Hamas members work for UNRWA.
الإنسان الفلسطيني المنتمي لحماس منتشر في كل المؤسسات.
No doubt that in Gaza they have a lot of employees from the Hamas, because that was one of the demands of the Hamas government. If you are not going to accept our members as an employees, we will kick you out tomorrow morning. Then UNRWA, in terms to survive, they accept such kind of condition because they want to continue their activities. They want to continue corrupting the Palestinians. They want to continue surviving on the Palestinian cause. So they accept such kind of condition.
Also, it now appears that UNRWA is breaking U.S. law by investing its funds with the Arab Bank and the Commercial Bank of Syria. The U.S. believes these financial institutions are complicit in money laundering and terror financing. Just who has been working in UNRWA schools? People like Saeed Sayyam, the former Hamas Minister of Interior and Civil Affairs. He taught for 23 years.
قدم فيه حماس الشهداء حتى هذه الساعة في القطاع دفاعا عن أرضنا وشعبنا.
Then there is Awad al-Kik, the ex-headmaster of an UNRWA school in Gaza. He led the Islamic Jihad engineering unit that built bombs and Qassam rockets. After his death, UNRWA students praised his memory at their school.
أبا محمد عشت مربيا فاضلا ورحلت مجاهدا قائدا أبا محمد.
And then there's Suhail al-Hindi, head of the UNRWA Teachers Union in Gaza. Al-Hindi brought former Hamas leader Sheikh Yassin, who also served as an UNRWA teacher, to an UNRWA school to lecture about suicide bombing and martyrdom. This is what al-Hindi told students. The road to Palestine runs through the blood of our martyrs. To get a better understanding of UNRWA, we met with UNRWA representative Christopher Gunnis to discuss UNRWA operations.
What's the most important service UNRWA provides?
You have to ask the refugees that question. It's easy for me to answer. I would say education, because through our education, We educate 500,000 children in the Arab countries and territories on the borders of Israel. That means in UNRWA's hands is the ability to educate the next generation of children who will be living in countries around Israel.
If education is one of the core missions of UNRWA, it appears that the next generation of UNRWA graduates will be espousing anything but peace with their neighbor Israel.
When we visited UNRWA schools and camps across the West Bank and Gaza, teachers and students expressed a collective voice that suggested that only through renewed violence would they be able to attain their goal, the destruction of Israel. While UNRWA denies that any of its work has led to violence, its offices and schools sit side by side with what could only be called a culture of war. Perhaps the most striking example of this culture is in UNRWA's schools. In Gaza and the West Bank, nearly 10,000 teachers and school administrators employed by UNRWA belong to Hamas-dominated unions, which call for the destruction of Israel. Inside the schools, teachers adhere to a curriculum that inculcates anti-Israel teachings at every level. Students are taught that all of Israel is occupied Palestinian land, and Israelis are portrayed as snakes and murderers. Zionism is described as a racist movement. The armed struggle is an important part of the students' lessons. We shall return. We shall return. We shall return to the homes, to the valleys, to the mountains, under the flags of glory, jihad, and struggle, with blood, sacrifice, fraternity, and loyalty. In public, UNRWA distributes glossy folders and informational packets extolling the virtues of its work with refugees. But there's no mention of the 41 former UNRWA students who became suicide bombers and killed 83 people and injured 436. One former UNRWA student who tried to become an Islamic martyr was Wafa El-Bas. After being badly burned in 2005, she was brought to an Israeli hospital in Beersheba. 2 months after she was first treated, she returned to the hospital with an explosive belt strapped to her body. But before she got to the hospital, she was apprehended by Israeli security. She is now in prison.
ما حسيتش بالخوف، ما شعرتش ان انا مثلا خايفه، شعرت براحه شديده لان انا رايحه الاقي ربنا وراح استشهد وراح اعمل شيء في سبيل الله يعني. ما شعرتش باي شيء الا براحه يعني تامه.
كنتي فرحانه؟
كثير فرحانه. وراضيه عن نفسي جدا يعني، لاني كنت بدي هيك اشوف الشهداء اروح على الجنه وهيك اشياء وارض ربنا بالنهايه.
شو كان في راسك جوا في راسك لما سقرتي عينيكي وشفتي شو كان في راسك؟
تخيلت حالي في الجنه، تخيلت حالي بين الشهداء، تخيلت حالي بين الانهار والحور العين وهيك حاجات. يعني كان شعوري مرتاحه جدا وانا برتدي في الحزام الناسف، لان كان عندي مبدا اني احاول اقتل اكبر عدد من اليهود، يعني هيك تكون يعني عدد كثير من اليهود قتلى هيك.
A visit to UNRWA schools and camps confirms that martyrdom is still extolled in the most public places. At the UNRWA Dehesha refugee camp elementary school near Bethlehem, students pass by murals of several suicide bombers every day in front of the school. One prominent suicide bomber was Ayat El-Ahras, a former UNRWA student. In 2002, the 18-year-old girl blew herself up at a Jerusalem supermarket. 2 people were killed. One was Rachel Levy, an 18-year-old girl who grew up in America. Here, the former UNRWA student pledges that the Intifada will continue until victory.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا شهيد الحي آيات محمد لطفي الأخرس، أقوم بعملي هذا خالصا لوجه الله العلي القدير، وأقول للحكام العرب: كفاكم نوما وكفاكم تخاذلا وتقاعسا عن أداء الواجب تجاه فلسطين. وأقصاه وأقصاه وفلسطين وفلسطين، الله أكبر والله أكبر على الظالمين، وإنها لانتفاضة حتى النصر. الشهيد آيات محمد لطفي الأخرس.
In recent years, more and more evidence shows that militants have all but taken over UNRWA.
For decades, armed militants have operated openly in UNRWA camps. Even more than 20 years ago, UNRWA was aware that its students were participating in riots and even helped coordinate their actions. Meet Zakaria Zabeidi. A graduate of the UNRWA school in Jenin, Zabeidi rose through the ranks to become the leader of the most violent terrorist organization in the West Bank. As the head of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades in Jenin, he was the most wanted man in the West Bank and dispatched suicide bombers and terror gangs.
كان وظيفتي كالتالي انه التنسيق ما بين إدارة المدرسة والطلاب في موضوع المظاهرات والخروج من المدرسة والدخول عليها.
These days, on the streets of the refugee camps, UNRWA students speak openly about becoming martyrs. 2 8th graders said that dying for their country is the duty of a Palestinian.
لازم يلحق الشهادة ويلحق النصر، يكون مع الشهداء والصديقين وينصر إخواننا المسلمين ويدافع عن أرضه.
هذول أنا بعتبرهم أبطال عند ربنا وعند عند الفلسطينية، عشان بسوي المستحيل عشان أرجع بلادي.
In Gaza, an UNRWA student stood next to a Hamas leader and declared his right to liberate Palestine. In the Shuafat UNRWA camp in East Jerusalem, Palestinian parliament member Jihad Abu Znaid held an impromptu class on a street.
شو الدور اللي بتلعبه عشان تحرر فلسطين؟ شو ايش بتلاقي حالك كيف؟
نحارب فلسطين.
We want to fight.
نحارب عشان نرجع بلدنا.
كيف؟
مش مبسوط.
He said guns. ايش كمان؟
بالحكي.
Talking by talking. by talking مع مين تحكي؟
بالحجار.
by stones. Okay, he mean civic.
بالسلاح.
by guns.
بالصواريخ.
صواريخ. we don't have ما عندناش صواريخ ولا أربجيل.
لا من دبل.
When we met with Palestinian Education Minister Lamis Al-Alami to ask her about what UNRWA is teaching about Israel, she denied that Israel was even part of the curriculum.
Are you teaching about Israel now?
No, we're not.
You're not teaching? Not really?
No.
For the last several years, Dr. Arnon Gross, a Jerusalem researcher, has conducted an intensive examination of Palestinian textbooks. Gross believes that Palestinians have created a curriculum for war.
The parameters of Palestinian textbooks, I mean the line or the goal or the mission of Palestinian education is that there is denial of legitimacy, demonized description of the other, and no peace with the other is advocated. Now, non-recognition, demonization, no peace advocacy, emphasis on armed struggle for liberation with no geographical limit, all that makes all that make a curriculum of suspended war. It is not a curriculum for peace.
But Al-Alami praised the textbooks and school curriculum.
I must say that in the first place, it's a Palestinian curriculum, and we're free to do with it whatever we want, whatever we feel is important. I mean, when the Palestinian curriculum was designed, I think the people in charge did an excellent job because they researched, most of the curricula in the Arab world. They looked at, European models and others, and came up, with the curriculum that suits our needs. So it was not haphazardly done. And I think, with the Palestinians, they have long experience in education, and everybody knows that.
Over the years, the curriculum has become more and more militant.
أكيد في فرق بين مين هو المعلم اللي بيعلمهم، قناعته. يعني إذا هو بده يتعلم من يعني أشخاص بيميلوا لإطار ديني معين، فبالتالي بيعتبر إسرائيل هي دولة لازم تزول.
This feeling is shared by many residents in UNRWA camps.
أهم شيء عندنا بحياتنا إنه إحنا نحلم حلم وبنعمل جاهدين إن نرجع لبلادنا، لأنه الحياة في داخل هذا المخيم لا تعني إلا ولا شيء. هي بنعتبرها مرحلة بحياتنا رايحة تنتهي آجلا أم عاجلا، وإحنا من حتم إن نرجع لبلادنا بأي وسيلة من الوسائل، ونثبت حقنا أن هاي البلاد اللي هي تهجرنا منها وتدمرت هي بلادنا، وليس تمت بأي صلة لليهود إلا من قريب أو من بعيد.
Some even think Palestinians should be able to gain access to atomic weapons.
الحرب بتطور الدنيا، بتتطور. امبارح بقينا نحارب بالسيف، بعدين صارت برودة، بعدين صارت مدفع، بعدين صارت طيارة، بعدين اليوم نووي. إن الله قدرنا إن احنا نقدر نراجع زي ما هم بيحذروا في نووي بنحذر نووي.
But not everyone agrees with UNRWA and the Palestinian leaders. Back in the early 1970s, Israel built houses for Palestinians outside the UNRWA camps, but they were threatened by camp leaders who told them they had to remain. Now people like Bassam Aid think it is time to stop funding UNRWA and close the agency. Aid grew up in an UNRWA refugee camp and has watched as the agency has hired more and more militant Islamic employees, while its curriculum has become increasingly militant. He is now director of the Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group.
The main goal and the main aim of UNRWA, how to keep is such refugee status for as a permanent issue forever. And that makes the people so frustrated and so tired from UNRWA organization.
Inside the UNRWA camps, many other residents agree and say they're receiving fewer services than ever.
كنا ما ندفعش ولا كهرباء ولا مي، كنا نشرب المي على حساب الوكالة. اليوم احنا بندفع المي، بندفع الكهرباء، بندفع كل شيء. ايش بدي في خدماتها؟ ما بتلزمنيش خدماتها، حاليا الايام هذه ما بتلزمني خدماتها. بلزمنا الوكالة تيجي تقول بس انه وقفنا.
Meanwhile, when we visited one UNRWA school, we found the conditions deplorable.
What worries me is that in the long term, UNRWA is not offering any solution, and it's sort of doing maintenance for the refugee camps, keeping them where they are. I don't see UNRWA offering any solutions or alternatives to these poor people. UNRWA is not involved in trying to find them any houses or even in building houses for them in other places. So what we see is this sort of maintenance for these refugee camps, and it's sort of perpetuating the problem by keeping these refugees where they are. UNRWA, in many ways, is actually paying the refugees to stay where they are and to stay refugees.
One option that many are now suggesting is that the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees take over UNRWA. The High Commissioner already resettles refugees across the globe, and this branch of the UN has experience resettling Palestinians. In recent years, thousands of Palestinian refugees who lived in makeshift camps in Iraq have found new homes and jobs because of the High Commissioner. They now live in several countries, including Chile.
The Chilean government and later on civil society opened the door to this group of refugees.
يعني أنا فرحان كثير لأنها جتني يعني الحمد لله إنه الله رزقني ببنت أو ولد يعني الحمد لله والشكر اثنينهم نفس الشيء. قامت بالسلامة والبنت اجت بخير وبسلامة وكاملة الخلقة. زين والفرحة الثانية إنها انولدت يعني إنه في بلد زي أختها مريم انولدت في المخيم. هي انولدت وأتمنى إنهم يحنوا علينا ويعطونا الجنسية على ضوء بنتي يعني. زين بنتي تشيلانية يعني أول بنت تشيلانية تيجي فلسطينية هون.
I want to get the good future and safety and get the nationality.
You want to become a Chilean?
Yes, yes, because in here I see a good people, a good country. No one wanted us, just Chile.
That is an inspiring story. That's one UN agency that does the job and provides real humanitarian assistance to our people. We need dignity and respect and a life that we can look forward to. Is that too much to ask for?
David, you have not only produced a shocking and remarkable film that the entire world has to see, but you've written a book called Where Has All the Flour Gone? Whims and Waste of the UN Refugee Palestinian Policy. Tell us about the book.
The function of the book, Where Has All the Flour Gone? The Whims and Waste of UN Refugee Policy, and the function of our website, IsraelBehindTheNews.com, is to give you the basics of information that everyone needs to have. Everything is public source. Everything is public domain. Nothing is material that can't be gotten. All we have done is consolidated the material for everyone to look at it, so that you know about how these policies have been created. And Abba Eban, Israel's foreign minister, way back in 1958, warned. He said that UNRWA would be a dagger in the heart of Israel, and he was correct. 10 years after Israel's founding in 1958, he already saw the disease happening of keeping people in refugee camps under the promise of right of return. And that's the issue that is stressed in terms of how this thing has been created, how this monster has been created of an educational system. The first educational system since the Third Reich, which demonizes Jews and prepares people for the possibility of killing Jews. And by the way, it's something which is clear. We purchased the Palestinian school book. We purchased the Palestinian Authority school books. And we got the Vatican to do the first translation of the books. Archbishop Sambi, who just passed away, who was the ambassador of the Vatican to Israel, to Jerusalem, he took a look at the books, he had them evaluated, and he recommended to all countries to pull their money out of the education system of the Palestinian Authority. He called them war manuals. War manuals. That's not coming from a Zionist source. That's coming from an objective source, not even a co-religionist. Because you look at it for what it is. A lot of people want to be in denial. There is no reason to be in denial. Everyone has to look at this and take it seriously for what it is. An educational system based on a refugee system designed to keep people in refugees and keep people in the cauldron of squalor, incited to fight to liberate Palestine, all of Palestine.
What are you doing about this? You've written the book, you've produced the film. What are you doing now?
Well, that's the important question. We are not putting this out although we're doing this within an academic framework. We have 3 PhDs who help us out. People have PhDs in Islamic studies helping us out. What we're doing with this is we're bringing this to the attention of the American Congress, the Canadian Parliament, the European Parliament, and also the Australian Parliament.
You have visited Ottawa recently, and you've been in the United States.
Ottawa only
in mid-September. I had a session, I had very, very important meetings with members of Parliament, with members of the staff of Deputy Prime Minister Jason Kenney, and I'm hoping to come back to Ottawa and make a presentation for a very large group of members of Parliament, and I would welcome the opportunity to visit synagogues and churches and community centres and hillels and wherever we can to raise people's consciousness in Canada about the seriousness of this issue and the opportunity that Canada has as the chairman of the Refugee Working Group set up 20 years ago to lead the way for a humanitarian solution to the descendants of Arab refugees. You know, we may not be able to solve the Middle East war. The Middle East is in a war since 1948. We can't solve that one. That's not something we can help you solve. But you can help us solve the most critical issue, which incites a whole generation of Arab children for war against Israel. And basically, this is not only an Israeli issue. This is a humanitarian issue, an issue of collective punishment of people from one generation to another to stay as refugees. It doesn't have to be that way.
How does that affect the world?
I couldn't hear the question.
How does what they're breeding, hatred against Israel, jihadism, how does that affect everybody?
When you are a child and your education is based on the fact that the Israelis came in, they murdered your grandfather and raped your grandmother and took the home, your ancestral home, which you've been in for who knows how many generations, at least that's what they're being taught. You're inspired to make war. But in case they don't get the hint, part of the educational curriculum, which we show in the movie,
you do,
we're
yes.
reciting poems at the beginning of every day, calling for people to liberate all of Palestine through jihad. That's part of the education. And that's something that has to be understood.
And something for the entire, I just have a minute to finish up, something for the entire world is being affected. What happens in those refugee camps?
This has the power to go all over the world, because the reason why they put out their material also in English. You can look up the website, PalestineRemembered.com. It's in English and in Arabic, so that Arabs who do not read Arabic can read in English all the places that were taken by Israel since 1948, and Mahmoud Abbas at the United Nations on September 23rd made it very clear that they're not talking about the 67 lines, they're talking about the 1948 lines. This is an issue that everyone should be concerned about, because it's at a time when everyone's talking about a peace process. UNRWA is talking about a war process and preparing people for war, and the fact that it's supported by Western countries, that gives you the opportunity to do something about this.
David Bedein, I thank you very, very much. Shana Tova, and all the best.
Thank you very much, and use our website religiously, IsraelBehindTheNews.com, and let us know what you think of our book, Where Has All the Flour Gone?
Thank you, David.